turning our attention primarily to what's going on with Mr. Julian Assange, but some of the Espionage Act elements surrounding him that are also very relevant, but a very critical moment for Mr. Assange. And we are, as always, very, very happy to be joined by Kevin Gosztola live from the Windy City of Chicago. He's the managing editor of Shadowproof.com, the curator of thedissenter.org, and the co-host of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, which has its own other co-host who's pretty good as well. I'll let you check out Unauthorized Disclosure to find that out. But of course, very happy to have Kevin with us here as always.
Hey, and I definitely liked the show now. So everybody, you have no excuse, because if a guest can do it, you can do it too.
I love it. Thank you, Kevin, for joining
the appropriate behavior here. We can always count on you on a number of different fronts. The first thing I want to start with here, obviously, is the case of Julian Assange, which we've been covering very, very closely for some time now. He just had an appeal denied, I believe. He's got maybe another one coming up, but it seems to be a very critical moment for him. Explain to us where his case sits currently.
Yeah, it's actually worse than having an appeal denied, because the High Court of Justice never heard the contents of the appeal. And this is justice severely delayed. Not only is it justice denied, as we've seen time and time again, but these appeals, I covered them, I reported on them back in July 2022. And we now see on June 6th that the court denies him even a day in the courtroom to come present the appeal and share the arguments and see what the judge's opinions are of his objections to extradition. And so it's really bad. This is something that could have been easily taken care of in 2 days, maybe a week, according to his Australian attorney, where you just go, oh, is there something to argue about? Well, no. And then one judge, not two judges, the US government had two judges hear their appeal when they didn't want to lose their extradition case back in 2021. One judge, Sir Jonathan Swift, they wear the fake wigs still in the UK, and he rules against Julian Assange. He doesn't even get a day in court. So now there is apparently a process where he can get a mini appeal, and now he will get the two judges, but he's only allowed 20 pages. So all of his appeal has to be condensed into like a Reader's Digest version for the judges. And it'll be like really fast moving hearing that he gets. And we know that they're already disposed to favor the US-UK allied relationship over granting Julian Assange anything approaching a fair hearing in court.
And of course, Kevin, as all of this is taking place, you do have Donald Trump being, I guess we're going to use the Espionage Act against him now, which is something he now shares in common with Julian Assange. I'm curious, not to pivot too much from Assange, but I actually think this is quite related. What do you make of these latest charges against Donald Trump? Is this something we should be concerned about? There's, of course, the irony of Donald Trump going after Julian Assange with the Espionage Act and then having it used against him. But what's the right way to be looking at this, I guess? Like, should we be cheering the Espionage Act being used against Donald Trump? Are there perhaps other avenues that could have been used against him? And why is this important when we talk about the ongoing persecution of whistleblowers? Yeah,
so to me, I don't know if you know what a Mobius strip is, but like where it like goes in and out and I have that image in my mind because I see the side of people who don't want Donald Trump to be prosecuted, and I see the people who are afraid of the expanded power that the Justice Department is wielding with this Espionage Act. But I also don't think Donald Trump is being repressed. I don't think Donald Trump is in danger of losing any of his civil liberties or anything like that as a result of this criminal case. He's actually receiving special treatment under the Espionage Act right now, as I understand it, based on covering people who are whistleblowers media sources, and then also Julian Assange. This is a man who was given no travel restrictions. He didn't have bond when he was in the courtroom. He is able to go do fundraisers and rallies. His Trump Force One, the private jet that he owns, is not required to stay grounded. He's allowed to travel anywhere in the United States, and he doesn't have to stay in the Miami area, as I already said. No travel restrictions. This is unheard of. And then the fact that the prosecutors for the Justice Department didn't even argue in his arraignment hearing that he might present a flight risk, which is what they do in every single Espionage Act case now, is what they did in NSA whistleblower Reality Winners case. It's what they did in drone whistleblower Daniel Hale's case, or what they would have done if it weren't for the fact that he was able to show that he had a supportive group that could take care of him. Jack Teixeira, a more complex, complicated case up in Massachusetts, the Air National Guard person who was posting documents to the Discord. Well, he's in detention right now because he was deemed a flight risk. And so Donald Trump is not being repressed. That said, any single Espionage Act case is a political case, just by virtue of the fact that leaks happen all the time in Washington, D.C. People who are in high-ranking positions in U.S. government are always leaking information to the New York Times, the Washington Post, about some of the most sensitive matters involving the war in Ukraine or in Afghanistan, China, Iran, you name it. And they would be guilty and charged with offenses if they were lower-level people who were objecting to this information because they wanted to be whistleblowers or they wanted to change the policy. But that doesn't happen to high-ranking officials. They're usually immune from any sort of consequences. But I do fear that this is a long way to get to the most important point, which is that given the over 100-year history of the Espionage Act as a tool of repression, I do fear what prosecuting someone like Donald Trump may do to the law to give it new life, to maybe make it seem like it isn't just this law that has been used to silence dissent, to make it seem like, oh, it could be this tool that gives us some accountability and justice for powerful politicians who think that they don't have to follow the rule of law.
No, I think that's an extraordinarily good point, and of course, it speaks very much to Assange because he's being criminalized for what is basically happening, as you say, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in terms of the sort of captured, neutered news media in Washington D.C. and other environs. And I'm glad you made the point of it being really a political case. I mean, I'll hold out as many hopes as I can for the United Kingdom's legal process. But one other element of this, of course, is the Australian government, what they will or will not do. The Prime Minister, I know, has made some points. How does that factor into what may happen to Mr. Assange ultimately? Or, I mean, maybe we don't know yet.
It's very important to have your home country finally advocating for you. Joe Biden canceled his trip to Australia because of the three-wing circus that is Congress that was having the debt ceiling talks. And so he stayed to continue to give the hostages, the hostage-taking terrorists, everything that they wanted from the Biden White House. And he has to go to Australia at some point, I'd presume. And he's going to meet, and Anthony Albanese, the Australia Prime Minister, will raise it because that's what they've been consistently doing. There have been people there who met with Caroline Kennedy, who's a diplomat, who had a conversation with them. So they're well on notice that Australia wants this to end, wants a resolution. It's not really clear what they mean by that, but I take that to mean that they would like to see some kind of a plea. Maybe if Julian Assange would take some responsibility and just, plead to time served or plead to a different charge or whatever. Maybe he could walk away from all of this. I believe that's probably what they're seeking. Julian Assange doesn't want to accept a plea, and that makes perfect sense. After all of this that he's gone through, why give up now? Why go ahead and be the one that caves to the power of the U.S. empire that you've been challenging and plead to a charge under the Espionage Act that is going to fundamentally shift the power from the hands of people like us who do journalism to the government, where they have a mechanism that they can go after and try and claw back documents that they don't want us to report on. Because what's going to happen is they'll come to us with someone who represents the Justice Department or is part of a legal department in an agency, and they'll say, use your opportunity, like what they did with Donald Trump. Give the documents that you have in your possession back to us now, and we'll just look the other way and we won't care about what you are doing and we won't try and charge you. But if you keep the documents and you try to report on them, we're going to have to prosecute you under the Espionage Act. And that's really the future of journalism if Julian Assange's case continues to push forward.
Right. And I mean, Kevin, as we enter into, almost the end of the Biden term, and we've seen obviously like the case against Julian Assange is at this point quite bipartisan, even if, Trump took it to a level that Obama was not prepared to. Joe Biden has continued with the Trump case against Assange, hasn't done anything to put a stop to it. I mean, what do you see happening next? I know it's hard to like predict the future, but you've written a book about Julian Assange. You've been covering this longer than anybody else. I mean, since it started, since the beginning of this case, and even before the whole issue of WikiLeaks, having observed this from beginning till now, where do you predict it going as we move towards another presidential election?
Yeah, I'm not the best prognosticator. Admittedly, I was wrong about Donald Trump when it comes to the Justice Department charging him. I just thought that knowing what happened with General David Petraeus, who was accused of leaking to his biographer who he was having an affair with, that his lawyers would negotiate and he would get out of it and he wouldn't be charged under the Espionage Act. But then that would have required Donald Trump to accept responsibility that he had done something wrong, which is not in Donald Trump's DNA. So as far as Julian Assange's case go, my best informed prediction is that we are going to see this continue to unfold very slowly, but he's running out of options, and it's very likely that in 2024, while Joe Biden is campaigning for re-election, unless we see something change, Joe Biden will be out on the campaign trail, and Julian Assange will be brought to Alexandria, Virginia, and arraigned, and the proceedings leading up to a trial will start to unfold before Joe Biden but people have an opportunity to vote for him in the general election. I don't know if that has any bearing as a backdrop, but I would expect that Donald Trump and his base, or whoever is the Republican challenger, will probably try to find a way to manipulate this against Joe Biden. I can only expect that they will lie and deceive their base as to the responsibility that Donald Trump has for the predicament that Julian Assange is in at Belmarsh High Security Prison. And so that's what I think looking forward. I did my best with my book to put together a guide for those who want to know the basic issues in this case. It's a sprawling case that extends to well over a decade. I've been on your show talking about a range of issues, but the CIA targeted Julian Assange while he was in the Ecuador embassy. They have a lawsuit against them right now that's being pursued by 2 journalists, 2 attorneys that were visitors that came to the embassy to meet with Julian Assange because their privacy rights were violated. We know that this private security company, UC Global, was working with the CIA, and they were basically engaged in a conspiracy to try and kidnap or even possibly kill Julian Assange while he was in the embassy. There was all this eavesdropping on attorney-client privileged communications. They did their best to prevent and succeeded in preventing Julian Assange from getting diplomatic status to leave the Ecuador embassy and fly to Ecuador, where he could enjoy his asylum and no longer live in an effective prison in the Ecuador embassy. This is a long way of saying that there are so many issues, and I really invite people to go through my book and become knowledgeable about them, because the defense that I make for Julian Assange, the case for his freedom in that book, is unfortunately one that Julian Assange will probably not be able to make in a courtroom in the United States. So the people outside of the courtroom have to be prepared to advocate for him in the court of public opinion. That is the only way that we can have a resolution that saves and spares Julian, because it is not going to happen with the legal system. The legal system in the UK is not going to save Julian Assange. The legal system in the United States is not going to save Julian Assange. The only people who can save Julian Assange are here. They're watching this broadcast. They're you and Rania, Eugene, and they're people who care about freedom of the press and liberties, and also care about access to information and care about liberation, care about what this information and the cables and the war logs did to wake us up to operations and foreign policy that was secret, that nobody wanted to admit was happening behind closed doors. You know, things like talking to divers to maybe potentially go do a sabotage operation against a gas pipeline. That's the kind of thing that were in the documents that were exposed by WikiLeaks, published by Julian Assange. That's why he's been targeted. That's why they wanted to shut him down. And that's why they are relentlessly pursuing Julian Assange and refuse to back down.
No, very, very good summary. Very important work. I hope people check out your book. I hope people follow all the things you're doing, from the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, the Dissenter.org newsletter, and shadowproof.com. As always, Kevin Gosztola, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.